Top story this week, Britain, a nation in enforced mourning. And now, I must admit, Andy, that the funeral of Margaret Thatcher this week did not get much attention here in America at all, mainly due to the fact that they were a little preoccupied with absorbing the latest example of terrorist twattery that brought horror to the streets of Boston, followed by the arrest of an Elvis impersonator who apparently sent rice into the president. So they've had a lot on their crazy plate here, and it's rather distracted them from the death rights of an 87-year-old stateswoman. Otherwise, Andy, I have no doubt that the US media would have dived headfirst into the overblown coverage like a lactose-intolerant lady into a soy milk swimming pool. But I'm guessing that in England, Andy, it was wall-to-wall coverage of the funeral with more hysteria than when a pigeon lands on the tennis courts at Wimbledon. Now, did you watch the funeral, or did you stuff straw into a box, poke some air holes in it, and fully hibernate the 90 minutes away?
Well, I was trying to deal with my own personal devastation, clearly, John. But no, I did watch the funeral, and I did some live Twitter commentary on it, which is really the only way to get through these state occasions. But as you say, there was wall-to-wall coverage, literally wall-to-wall in town squares in places like Edinburgh and Leeds, where they were showing the funeral on a big screen, and there was no one between the big screen and the wall on the other side of that town square. great photographs of just like one person staring up at this screen, saying, I'd rather see the weather forecast.
Yeah, could you put it on Sky Sports?
But, so it was, as we suggested last week, it was a very divisive funeral, very much put the FU into funeral. But at least now, we know the speculation is over. There was no resurrection. There was no opening of the fiery bowels of hell to welcome in their newest inmate. There was no, even most disappointingly, no classic prank of Thatcher bursting out of the coffin saying, got ya! She had the living shit funeral out of her, and Britain has seldom felt odder. It did leave me with an extremely queasy feeling about the British state and the nature and purpose of British democracy. It seemed, was this one of the greatest acts of history-controlling state propaganda in this country since the Bayeux Tapestry showed William the Conqueror personally scoring an overhead kick past King Harold from 45 yards in the last minute of the Battle of Hastings? It felt that way. It felt that way.
Now, for what I've gathered, Andy, the atmosphere was a little different from the blowout funerals that Britain has staged in the past. You think your Princess Diana's, your Queen Mother's. Now, for Margaret Thatcher, it seemed to be less goodbye England's rose and more farewell England's amorphophallus titanium. That's one for all you botany fans out there. It meant, Andy, what I'm trying to say is her career was spectacular, but occasionally had a horrific smell about it. Again, one more for you botany fans. Oh, it's a flower joke.
Isn't the internet great, John?
I mean, without it, we're nothing. I mean nothing. Nothing. There is nothing in my head than facts that go in, stay there for a second, and then go out again. I'm nothing.
So why was she... again, there was a lot of discussion over her legacy and why she was quite so divisive after all. She did some things that a lot of people thought were great for this nation, and maybe some of them were, but the problem is, John, she threw a lot of babies out with the bathwater, and not only did she do that, but before she did that, she boiled the babies down for stock, and then poured the stock down the drain in front of some starving northerners. So there's plans now to build a Thatcher Museum, which Margaret Thatcher Museum in the style of
like a presidential library.
A presidential library.
Oh, let's not start doing that.
Some would argue there are already plenty of Thatcher museums. The High Street in the northern town of Stockton-on-Tees, for example, seems to be a temple to urban decay and the failures and heartlessness of the Thatcher years. Also, the City of London. That's very much the opposite side of both sides of the Stockton-on-Tees museum. So I don't know if there's actually need for this. I had a special simulation run, John, on what would have happened to Britain if Thatcher had never actually existed. And I went to two, because I wanted to get some balance, I went to two different political organisations, the right-wing Thatcherite think tank, the Clawhammer of Practicality Institute, and the left-wing pressure group, Marxist Mark and the Fund Bunk. And one of these Oh, that needed more work. One of these simulations.
No, Andy.
So
no.
that without Thatcher.
Look, even masterpiece painters, Andy, need to know when to stop, and you stopped at the right time. It was finished.
Without Thatcher, apparently Britain today would be a cultural, industrial and ethical wasteland haunted by the post-imperial ghosts of the nation it could have been. And the other showed that without Thatcher, Britain would have been a thriving financial centre with higher standards of living than it ever had before, consumer choice and unprecedented commercial freedoms and opportunities. Oh, no, sorry, those are the wrong reports. Those are both just reports on what has actually happened after Thatcher, but from different parts of the nation.
There had been real concerns about protests during the funeral procession, but these luckily were limited to a few people shouting, booing, and then others lining the streets only to turn their backs. And that seems to be a quintessentially English insult, Andy. Standing outside for hours in the cold and rain, only to then snub the procession with a devastating gesture of poor manners.
There was also my favourite protest, it was just a guy standing by the route, and similarly, he must have waited there for hours, and he just held up a placard about a foot across and a foot high with the word "boo" written on it.
But that was it?
That was it. Yeah. That was it.
But I like the fact that by turning your back, essentially what you're saying to the former Prime Minister is, "Good day to you, Margaret." I said good day.
But there was, I guess, in some ways, there's two sides to every coin, John. It just depends which way you look at it. Some people might say there was a massive protest, and it was all a protest against the fact that she died. And I'd have liked to see the police react in the same way they've reacted with other protests and start kettling the crowd inside St Paul's Cathedral and firing water cannons at Henry Kissinger just to see if he dissolves.
Thousands of people lined the streets of London, along with 2,300, as you mentioned, inside St Paul's Cathedral, including Prime Minister David Cameron and even the Queen. And the fact that the big Q-tip herself was there was a big deal. And yet, all the cutaway shots of her face showed her wearing the same expression that she always has, Andy. That featureless, empty scowl somewhere between boredom and contempt. She has the same detached facial projection of nothing at every event she goes to, Andy, whether it's watching a funeral, or her grandson's wedding, or herself jumping out of a helicopter during the Olympics opening ceremony. Her face is the same during everything, Andy. Absolutely everything. In fact, she would be a world-class poker player, the Queen. I think that's the way we should fund the royal family in the future. Once a year, the taxpayer doesn't just give her money, we lend her money to go to Vegas for a week and hit the poker rooms. And I guarantee within a few days she'll come back having quadrupled it.
She had a very similar face to the one that she had during much of the Olympic opening ceremony.
Yeah.
And for me, I think, that Britain have shown what it can do with a big ceremony. And to me, this was too traditional. Should have embraced the new modernity that the Olympics Open. I'd have liked to see Margaret Thatcher escorted to St Paul's Cathedral by James Bond in a helicopter before having her coffin dropped from 2,000 feet through the famous dome.
Good. We know people like it, so why don't you do it? It doesn't make any sense. Now, one of the great things about funerals is that you sometimes get to find out little snippets about someone's life that you weren't aware of. And apparently Margaret Thatcher found the Queen a little too left-wing for her, which means one of two things. Either the Queen is a lot more liberal than anyone knew, or Margaret Thatcher was even more right-wing than physics thought was even possible. The relationship between Thatcher and the Queen was heavily spun by people, with one pundit saying both women shared a love of people being punctual. And if that is your go-to comparison for common ground, I think you might as well just say both women really didn't like one another.
There were some efforts made to keep the funeral as unpolitical as possible, but it didn't really succeed in a lot of ways. Just the mere fact of having it as essentially a state funeral was a great political gesture, and increasing suspicions, John, that David Cameron is fully delusional, such is the grief that has struck him and his party. Last week we just talked about how he said Margaret Thatcher saved this nation, and during the funeral there's a lovely moment. I was watching it on the BBC News channel with their little news ticker underneath, and as the coffin was wheeled into St Paul's Cathedral on its magic cart, little news flash came up on the little ticker saying unemployment up by 70,000. And you thought, that is what she would have wanted on that day of all days. David Cameron on national radio that morning, having pledged not to make the funeral a political occasion, said, "We are all Thatcherite now." And he might as well have just put a balaclava on, leapt on top of the coffin and said, "I'm hijacking this funeral, take me to the next election or else."
It was a spectacular send-off, and the Dean of St Paul's, the Reverend David Ison, said that Thatcher played a large part in planning the funeral herself over the last 6 years, and that it would be relatively humble, in line with her wishes. And I think it was relatively humble, Andy, in comparison to a rapper or Donald Trump or an ancient Egyptian king. But otherwise, I think it had a little more pizzazz than he is giving it credit for. When you have a full military procession, a flag-draped coffin, and in the front pew of your service sits the f***ing Queen, I think if you claim it's relatively humble, you're stretching the term relative to breaking point.
Well, that's a classic British understatement, John. That's what we do best on these occasions. If there's one, you could accuse this funeral of being many things, politically divisive, unnecessary on its scale. What you could not accuse it of, John, was being, as you suggested, insufficiently military. You would have thought, from the amounts of armour on display and the amount of uniforms, that Margaret Thatcher had personally headbutted Napoleon and Hitler to death simultaneously. And there was a lot of the commentators saying, well, this is, there have been some protests around the country, but this is a very sombre occasion, and I think this really shows what this is all about. Well, of course, it was a sombre occasion, John. If you took a trampoline in Goldfish and put 2,000 soldiers in shiny uniforms around it, walking slowly, and got a priest in the kind of robes that suggest his organisation is probably trying to hide something, it would give it gravitas. If you chucked 10 million quid and 700 soldiers in ludicrously inappropriate garb at one of the tasteless but understandable death parties that were going on at the same time in shattered former mining towns in the north, you'd have had something similarly serious. And I think the BBC coverage of it would have been well worth watching.
And a respectful silence falls across the town square now, a silence reflecting the absence of hope that descended on this place when the mines were closed down, some would argue, prematurely, and replaced not with new industries but with absolutely nothing. And just as, of course, Lady Thatcher would have wanted, and did want, and did. And that silence now is punctuated by the distant sound of a single London city trailer snorting cocaine off a prostitute's back. Respectful applause there, both for Nigel Polk, the trader, and 23-year-old Olga, both in their different ways, products of the Thatcher years. And, well, here comes the effigy now borne on the gun carriage by 6 horses of the North Snutterbridge 3rd Royal Dragoon, followed by a platoon of the long-term unimportant, as defined by the Conservative historian Charles Moore this week. And in front of them, carrying the ceremonial match for lighting the effigy, is 56-year-old Gavin Huish, who's been unemployed now for 28 years. That's exactly half his life, which, from the looks of him, after the physical and mental health problems he's suffered over the years, is going to be about as much as he can hope to get. And the crowd now bowing their heads in silent disrespect, spoiled only by a handful of dissenting voices. Protesters rather sullying this occasion. I think I can see one millionaire there holding up a placard saying, "I raked it in the 1980s, I don't know what your problem is." Very much a minority view on this occasion of solemnity and dignified reflection. And well, I think one of the pro-Thatcher protesters just threw a credit card at a horse. No one wants to see that. We approached the pyre, built from kindlings from the royal forests in the Sandringham estate, of course, with one single piece of coal that has been kept on display in the nearby British Museum of Willful Industrial Decline. This ceremony really is laden with history and meaning, and the hush descends. A single tear falls down Mr. Hewish's cheek, even though he only actually met Mrs. Thatcher once. Could be grief, could be joy. And yes, the effigy is now lit, and polite applause breaks out, and that really shows what this woman meant to these people and this nation. Farewell.
That's beautiful, Andy. God, we do pomp and circumstance well in Britain, don't we?
That's what we do in this country. And another thing that we do well in this country is leer at any quite attractive young woman who is shown on the telly. Now, It was quite extraordinary. Margaret Thatcher's granddaughter, Amanda Thatcher, who's a 19-year-old Texan, essentially, she came over for the funeral. No one had really seen her in this country before. And as you can expect from the kind of press that Britain has, and I know if you're not aware, just go on the Daily Mail website and look for the beautiful juxtaposition of articles complaining about the left-wing bias in British politics and media, and women without makeup or in bikinis. And the reaction to Amanda Thatcher being was extraordinary, John. I don't know if you picked this up in the States.
I'm afraid I did. It's almost the only thing that did make it over here. 19-year-old Amanda Thatcher knew Pippa Middleton. It was... I just don't know how comfortable I am with that at all, Andy. It's borderline okay for a nation to lust after a 28-year-old bridesmaid at her sister's wedding. It is a significantly greyer area to do the same over a 19-year-old girl mourning at her grandmother's funeral. That is really creepy, Andy. Really creepy.
Particularly when most of the press that were doing this lusting were the ones who'd been saying how important it was to mark this occasion with the depth of seriousness that it deserved.
Oh.
And again, the reaction was sort of along the lines of, well, what a great honour and occasion this is for a woman who represented everything great about this country. Margaret Thatcher, of course, the greatest Prime Minister in the history of the world. And there's her granddaughter, Amanda Thatcher, I would put it in that. Would you look at... do you think she'd let me call her Margaret? Oh, yeah. Oh, Britain is saved. Britain is saved. I'll tell you, those things aren't the only thing at half-mast now. Actually, they are again. Oh, in a heartbeat. I would and the nation would. Oh, do you think she could bleach her hair and comb it upwards? Oh, yeah. Oh, it's all coming back. It's all... Control yourself. And coffin now passes into the cathedral. Oh, yeah. A moment for this country to reflect on the greatness of its most glorious... Oh, no, single protester has a Down with Thatcher T-shirt on. That is completely inappropriate. Oh, Amanda. Oh, Amanda. Yeah.
It's much of the praise was clearly they knew it was inappropriate, so they had to try and focus it around her reading the lesson that she read. And you didn't really have to read too deeply between the lines to see what was really going on. They would say that she read beautifully and confidently and arrestingly and athletically and sumptuously and troublingly. And oh, Amanda, naughty Amanda. Oh, no. One newspaper in the UK even described her as the star of the funeral. Now, do funerals get to have stars, Andy? Is that appropriate? And if they do have stars, aren't they supposed to be the people in the f***ing coffin?
Well, it must have been very awkward for the family, this occasion, particularly for Amanda Thatcher, who's never been in the public eye, and has obviously just come for her grandmother's funeral, and has found what really ought to be a private family occasion turned into a festival of state propaganda. And it's not the first time this has happened. The Nuremberg rallies actually started as a memorial service for Hitler's pet hamster, Nigel. Now, let me say, I'm not equating Mrs. Thatcher with Hitler's hamster. Let me make that very clear. Other than they both helped curb the excesses of totalitarian regimes, Thatcher helped bring the Cold War to an end, and Nigel really kept Hitler's more extreme views under wraps until his sad passing in the mid-1930s.
It must be so weird for Amanda Thatcher, though. You know, she's at college here in Texas, and I just cannot imagine how she's going to articulate what happened to her college friends. Oh, Amanda, welcome back. How did it go? It was f***ing weird. It was very weird. I'm going to stay off the internet for a while. I was not expecting that. I'm glad I live here.
Well, it was interesting also seeing the Conservative Party embracing this, the kind of public toxicity of the Thatcher brand once again, after kind of realising that maybe that will be enough to see them through to an election. I guess, as the old saying goes, one man's poison is another man's pinata.
I mean, I don't know what that means, but I like the way it sounds, Andy.
I think,
I mean, that's much more important.
I think that was Wittgenstein, wasn't it? Was that Wittgenstein?
It sounds like him.
He loved a pinata. Oh, Ludwig, didn't he?
Of course he did.
Of course he did. He's not an idiot.
After the funeral, I was getting a bus through the city, and I saw like a bunch of sort of fresh-faced, young, conservative types. They're all about like 19, 20 years old. They really stuck out like a sore thumb. So I pulled my camera phone out to take a photo. Yeah. And just after I took it, I looked both to the left and the right of me on the bus, and 2 other people were doing the same thing. It was incredible.
There were a lot of highlights. Particularly George Osborne, the Chancellor, who shed that single tear. There was a moment when I thought he was just going to hurl himself into the coffin, screaming, "No, take me, take me!" And 10 million quid, John. Not spectacular enough for me for 10 million quid. I'd have wanted at least a kind of Hunter S. Thompson-style firework across the sky. Or at least we could have had a repeated part of the opening Olympic opening ceremony, but with the factories magically disappearing into the ground to symbolise everything that Thatcherism stood for.